Hi everyone, my name is Rickards. I'm a professor at RMIT University in Melbourne, and I'm here with my colleague Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Farhall. I'm an honorary research fellow also at RMIT University, but I also work in government in my day job.
We are so delighted to be here and really honoured to be part of this really important conversation. What we're presenting today stems from research we did with the Australian Council for the International Agricultural Research, who take gender very seriously and were very encouraging to us exploring the questions that we've been looking at in this research, which we did with a number of dear colleagues as well up there on the screen. So today what we wanted to do was to sort of step back and talk about this question of the emergence of the gender agenda itself, which of course we are actually demonstrating with the existence of this conference. Now, as we know, there's been decades of really important feminist scholarship on this question of gender, and so this idea of having gender on the agenda does beg the question of, well, what exactly is being said? What exactly is being pursued? What are the policy goals? And so what we wanted to do was to look at the adoption, if you like, of some of the key criticisms and critiques and ideas and suggestions coming out of the feminist academic scholarship and how they're being applied in policy. And what we found, unsurprisingly, is that there's a great diversity. So it really is important to look in the fine detail of what's being said. So Kate's going to lead us through the first half of our presentation now. Thanks. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Lauren. So we just wanted to start by touching on some of those discourses emerging from the feminist academic literature looking at gender in agriculture and development. What are these ideas that scholars have been coming up with over decades? So to give you a quick rundown of kind of what's out there and how it's evolved a fair bit over time, we sort of started, in agricultural development with critiques from feminists that identified there was a really kind of gender blind approach to development that overlooked women, didn't kind of understand development in terms of its gendered implications and the kind of gender relationships that might exist on the ground and across multiple scales. So in the 1970s, there was a real kind of push from scholars around this idea of women in development. So this was an explicit recognition that women exist in development and that they're a particular cohort with particular experiences or needs potentially. So just introducing this kind of question around where are women in development, what are they doing, what do we know about them? From there, the scholarship moved into a second phase around gender and development. So moving just from like, where are women, what do we know about them, into a broader discussion of gender norms and gender relations. So where are men in this question of gender? How do gender norms of men and women, how are they implicated in development practice? From there was a real push to move into what's called gender mainstreaming. So I'm sure you've all heard that term before. So this idea that gender isn't kind of a special silo that we work on separately, but rather a topic that infuses all aspects of society and needs to be really embedded and mainstreamed across development work. Subsequent to that kind of gender mainstreaming push, there was a real recognition of intersectionality. So the idea that, gender groupings aren't monolithic, but they're impacted by all these other axes of difference and forms of social stratification that really shape and inform and potentially exacerbate individuals' experiences of gender or gender inequality. Lastly, more recently, there's been a real drive to try and address some of the underlying structural root causes of gender inequalities at multiple scales in the development picture. And this is often referred to as a gender transformative approach. So not trying to just deal with those kinds of surface level or symptoms of gender inequality, but really tackle those drivers of inequality in societies. So how do all these emergent ideas and discourses coming out of the academic literature play out in the policy context? We really wanted to understand how agricultural development organisations were talking about gender and whether they had or hadn't incorporated some of these ideas that were emerging from the scholarship. So to do this, we chose 6 agricultural development bodies, roughly along kind of 3 different categories. So firstly, a couple of large policy organisations. So we chose the Food and Agriculture Organisation and the World Bank. Secondly, we wanted to look at some more research network type organisations. So we chose CGR and GFRAS. And then lastly, we wanted to look at some of the big kind of aid and development organisations. So we looked at USAID and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list, it's a sample, so it's not telling us what's been done across the full kind of spectrum of agricultural development work, but it gives us a picture of how some different types of organisations are approaching gender and development in agriculture. So once we selected our organisations, we chose a variety of documents and materials that they'd produced around gender and agriculture. So this included things like big strategy documents related to gender and agriculture, their gender website or the portion of their website dedicated to gender, as well as documents that were recommended to us by some interviewees that we spoke to as part of the broader project. And once we'd collected all these materials, we conducted a feminist discourse analysis. So we went through and looked at the ways in which, gendered forms of power and privilege were emerging or being contested in those narratives. And what we found was there were a lot of different kinds of narratives and different ways in which ideas around gender and agriculture from the feminist literature were being incorporated into the policy work. And we found there were 2 really strong discourses that came through in our data. So firstly, the idea that women were a tool to achieve development that could be kind of leveraged for development, broader development goals. And secondly, the importance of participatory approaches to development. So maybe we should actually go and speak to some people about this. So that first strong theme, women as a development tool, really hooked into this idea of smart economics approaches, which tend to position women as a kind of a resource or a means through which to achieve other development goals, whether that's sort of financial, nutrition, etc. So this is an example from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in one of the documents from that organisation that we looked at. They spoke about how together we can support opportunities that ensure women farmers are meeting their potential, contributing to sustainable productivity and driving poverty reduction and hunger alleviation. So there's not a lot about gender equality in there. It's mostly about how women can be, supported to achieve broader development goals. The other strong discourse that we found was around this idea of participation and participatory approaches. So this was kind of widely acknowledged in a lot of our data for reasons that was sort of centered around the importance of participation itself and how that might achieve more effective development outcomes, but also ways that it could be used sort of instrumentally. And this is always a bit of a complex thing. There's actually a lot of debate in the literature around how do we do participation effectively. So there are some scholars here talking about the importance of recognising that forms of inequality and the relationships between inequalities are locally specific, historically contingent, shifting and enmeshed. So we really need to get in there, understand what's happening on the ground in order to be able to, create some effective change. So there were some concerns in the way that participation might be used as to whether it was tackling hierarchies or perhaps just talking to those who already had some prominence or power within a community. So there's sort of good and bad ways of doing participation, essentially. Aside from those 2 really strong discourses, we also noticed a third discourse around intersectionality. It wasn't as prevalent as those first 2, but it was evident, but there were some kind of complications around the use of intersectionality as well in the policy literature. So obviously, there was a real acknowledgement that it's important to understand how intersecting forms of oppression, interact in different ways to produce different forms of inequality and disadvantage. But sometimes it was really interesting that some organisations kind of took that to a more extreme end, risking a kind of individualization of those social problems, which really obscured the ways in which social identities are shared, and we sometimes need to look for social patterns in order to address different forms of structural inequality rather than looking at individuals. So this is an example from one of the documents we looked at that talked about how, you know, of course, each individual posits many intersecting identities, which in a given situation and context may be sources of both privilege and oppression. So really trying to capture the nuance of the lived reality of people's experiences, but at the same time, you know, focusing on the ways in which intersecting identities produce both privilege and oppression. Different individuals might have different intersections, kind of does that work of perhaps masking those structural forms of oppression that might be faced by a given group in a given community.
Thanks, Kate. And so I want to now pick up with three further discourses, which we call the quieter discourses. So these are ones that we identified in the literature that weren't so prominent in the policy discourses, noting, of course, that, you know, it's the policy discourses are very mixed and variable. So there are certainly some good examples. The first one of these is this idea of understanding that gender is relational. Women don't just exist in isolation, and that very much men are gendered as well. And in fact, that masculinity, of course, is applied to a lot of things other than humans, including things like cows versus chickens. So when you looked at this is where the policy discourse really did get quite quiet. Really not a whole lot on masculinity, in particular, referring to it only a relatively few number of times. And what we're finding there is that there's kind of a reluctance, a delay, if you like, in actually really approaching this question of men as part of the gendered structures that we need to think about. And so while there is some signs of mainstreaming, if you like, it's only really happening quite slowly. So that's one of the frontiers, if you like, though. Of course, that's a masculine concept in itself. Then the second quiet discourse, again, where progress could be made, is this question around gender norms and the co-responsibility for gender equality. And so this idea of actually making sure that it's not just about the workshops for women, it's not just about educating women, for example, in good nutrition and all these questions, if they're in a domestic situation where their choices to actually, their ability to actually enact and act on that information are very limited because of the very restrictive gender situation in that domestic environment, and then of course the broader social environment. So this is about really saying that, of course, you know, women's equality is not just a women's issue. And then we get to the last one where we're talking about the gender transformative approaches, those approaches that really try to look at some of the deeper structural changes. To be honest, we thought this might be the quietest. It wasn't the quietest. There is some interesting stuff, including by the World Bank there, asking, calling for transformative change. So, for example, attempting to change prevalent attitudes and social norms that lead to discrimination. However, you know, there's very light on detail about how any group, little less, you know, a group such as that is actually going to set about trying to change those attitudes and norms. So again, you know, a work in progress, if you like. So overall, what we found was that, you know, the gender agenda is alive and well. There is a rich array of different policy discourses that are really putting this into practice. But there's, you know, a lot of mixture of discourses. Even within the one policy document, you would find a mixture of these different approaches, sometimes in a sort of contradictory way, which is, of course, you know, the world we're in. We all work in institutions that are full of these contradictions. That said, there were some patterns. As we indicated, some of those feminist arguments have been adopted more than others. Some are more palatable, if you like, perhaps a better fit. And there is still a tendency to instrumentalise women, so to look for how this gender agenda can be leveraged and harnessed to achieve other outcomes, such as economic development. And the ones that are actually more transformative, looking at tackling some of the drivers of gender inequality, promoting shared responsibility, that's where there's still quite a bit of work to go. There's also a whole lot of work where there was absolute silence, not just quiet discourse, but absolute, drop a pin type silence. Two of those, so one in particular was that actually gender pervades our development institutions, our donor nations. So there was very much a sense of kind of tackling the gender issue out there rather than looking inwards. And we all know we're in institutions and countries, we certainly are here in Australia, where there's huge problems with gender inequality that need to be tackled. That is not yet coming through in the policy. And of course, this idea of actually not just thinking about gender as a response to these big global challenges, but actually generating some of the problems. And my own area of work focuses on climate change, and that's very much true in that regard. So the actual generation of climate change, rather than just looking at the gendering of, say, climate change adaptation, needs to actually be addressed as well. And we know, again, from the Australian context, that there's a lot of gender bias in the generation of fossil fuels and greenhouse gases. So we also wanted to end by just pointing to how much work is left to do, that this is really just a step down a particular road. And one of the big questions that we had as we finished this was this question of, well, why is it that these feminist critiques, these feminist concerns get framed the way they do? We've talked about it here as a matter of adoption. We're very aware of the limitations of that term, as people in agriculture especially know. It's actually just really much more about a question of context and fit. And sometimes we have to be aware that it's not naive, that sometimes it might be that particular gender discourses are used for politically smart ways in a tactical sense. So, for example, the subversive use of something that's understood to be palatable just to get going. And I know, again, from my own institutional work, just how prevalent this sort of thing can be and how important and useful this approach can be. And really, to understand what's going on, why certain discourses are chosen, we need to work with practitioners and do a lot more in-depth work. So, and just to finish off, Kate's
Yeah, so how do we do this? How can we drive this change together? We thought we'd sort of co-opt some masculine terminology here at the end to really push our point. So we thought, it was important to think about how we can work on kind of shared intelligence, complementary tactics and alliances. How can we create coalitions that really bridge that academic practitioner gap in order to sort of better understand both kind of where both groups are coming from and how these ideas can be, contextualized and fit into different practical applications, but also being reflexive in thinking about how our own institutions are complicit in some of these adoptions of feminist narratives as well. And, particularly having recently moved into government work, seeing the policy side of things and how strategic approaches to gender equality can be quite useful. I think it's important to think about how we can drive those together more effectively as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, look, we really look forward to continuing the conversation. We hope to have the chance to do so despite the time differences and everything. But thank you again for the opportunity to be involved, and we really look forward to hearing what everyone else gets to say as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.